Right, I think we'll get started. Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our medical bioethics webinar with Group Captain Diane Lamb and Lieutenant Alan Brocky, Lieutenant Commander, apologies, Alan Brocky, who's joined us this afternoon. We're really excited. It's going to be a really interactive workshop this afternoon, so we really want your participation. So please do ask questions as we go through. There's opportunity for questions at the end, but we want you to share your comments and thoughts as we go through this afternoon. I'm Lucy Brown. I'm the Deputy Director of the Florence Nightingale Academy, and it's a real pleasure to be able to host today. We will be recording the session, so please be mindful of what you, anything you say, anything you place in the text box as well. If you do have an issue with the recording, please do let us know, and we'll do our best to support you with that. But just going to give a quick introduction and bio for Group Captain Di Lamb. So Group Captain Di Lamb is a Defence Professor of the Nursing Research and Clinical Innovation. She's a registered general nurse and specialised in critical care in the RAF and the air support team, so a wealth of knowledge and expertise. She's got a Master's in Research Methodology and also a PhD in Human Factors and Aeromedical Evacuation. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome Di this afternoon. We're equally delighted to welcome Alan as well. So Alan is a Lieutenant Commander in the Royal Naval Nursing Service, specialises as a theatre nurse and also a bioethicist, so that's why he's with us this afternoon. He's got a Master's in Healthcare Law and Ethics and is also studying towards a PhD in Ethical Decision Making. So great skills to share with us this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across to Alan, who's going to share his presentation this afternoon. But please do ask any questions, either raise your hand, which is at the bottom of the icons, at the bottom of the screen, or place a question or comment in the chat box, and I can ask it on your behalf if you don't feel you want to ask yourself. Okay, thank you ever so much, and handing across to Alan.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, I'm a theatre nurse. Do try not to hold that against me. And I'm more of a burgeoning bioethicist as we go through things, you'll discover. So let's move on to the first slide. Right, there we are. So ethics is and always has been and probably always will be a very difficult and vague topic to define and understand. So by its nature, it's an area of study that's just crying out to be debated and discussed. It's important to note that there are no right or wrong answers in ethics. And in fact, the more you ask questions in ethics, particularly amongst ethical circles, that's going to prompt more questions than it is answers. The idea today is not to bamboozle you all, well, maybe a wee bit at first, but essentially, I want to get nurses doing what we do best and talk to each other, in this case about ethical issues. So that way we can use this short series of talks to arm you as our bright shiny lights of nursing leadership with the tools to structure effective ethical discussions with your teams and your subordinates using case-based learning backed up by a bit of theory, using some practical models and open discussion as the next few sessions and months go by. And
Oh, Alan, unfortunately, you've
very unprofessional. Yeah, I'm just doing it in between turning pages, don't worry. So what we're looking at today is we'll have a bit of a chat about some ethical development and a sort of basic look at the theories, the prevalent theories, a little bit on ethical decision making, and then I'll introduce you to some popular thought experiments which get people talking and thinking about practical ethics and where they sit in the scheme of things. There'll be a bit of a case discussion and a quick look at some of the common ethical issues that you might encounter in nursing, followed up with, not wishing to teach anybody to suck eggs, there's some very senior nurses on here today, but just a little bit about top tips in ethical leadership in nursing, which is probably more aligned to those who are sort of newer to nursing, perhaps.
Alan, is your Debbie McGee for today, in your trusty assistant? Can I just convey before we get started a quick message from Roger? Why do we bother with ethical concerns if there can be no right or good answers?
Stop asking me difficult questions, Roger. I'm going to get you later. Just to explain, Roger is one of my supervisors for my PhD and he's managed to sneak on here today to watch me. I think we can address that later, otherwise we're going to run out of time. So I will come back to you later on that. Is that all right? we can discuss it at the end if we've got time. Okay, so in between finishing my master's in healthcare law and ethics and preparing for the PhD, I had a bit of an epiphany, really. In the military, we have what we call pre-deployment training, which gets us ready to go out on operational deployments around the world. And we do medical exercises as part of that. Now, we were always told in these medical exercises that ethical decisions were going to be a team effort. So everybody would have a voice, etc. But unfortunately, what I discovered, particularly in the operating theatre, was that I tended to feel a bit excluded and maybe a bit disenfranchised from the decision-making process, almost like my voice wasn't worth listening to. So that's why I chose to explore ethical decision-making amongst nurses in combat and humanitarian operations for my study. And I just wonder if you've all felt the same way at some point during your careers. But the epiphany that I had was that medical ethics are for everyone, not just doctors, as is the traditional view. Why should doctors have the only say? Because I believe, and Benner shares my concerns, my beliefs, that every action we undertake in our nursing practice has an ethical or moral base. Now just think about it for a moment. Our decisions in practice, they influence other people. And because the potential exists in that space to have an effect on someone else's life, any nursing practice, to me then, is by default a moral endeavor. So every interaction we have with our patients, military or civilian, has, from the smallest reassurance to the largest clinical intervention, has personal, professional, and social ethical implications. And the wider literature actually supports that view as well. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at some morals and ethics. So what's the difference between morals and ethics? Essentially, morality is understanding the distinction between right and wrong and living according to that understanding. And ethics is the philosophy of how that morality guides individual and group behavior. So put simply, at its roots, ethics is more a system of principles which assist in decision making. Now, the two are very closely related, with morality being the foundation of ethics. So how do we develop our own unique approach to life and our own personal ethics? Well, from a number of sources. We have primary family socialization and secondary socialization. So that's outside your family, at school, through friends, religion, the law, culture and society, etc., which is why bioethics is called bioethics. It's essentially the ethics of living. And it's an evolving process which takes account of the sweeping changes in attitude and societal development, as well as cases like rapidly advancing technology. Now, we can demonstrate that throughout history. Due to research advances and technology, we no longer steer people away from medicine and steer them towards prayer to cure them. We have a big interest in public health now, particularly these days, following epidemics in the past. And in 1948, we sort of realized our socialist conscience despite heavy resistance and created the NHS, because access to healthcare was not what I would regard as particularly ethical just before this, because it tended to exclude the poorest in society that couldn't afford it. But here's a question for you. Is something good because the church or your school or your parents or the law says it is, or is it because it's right that the church or your school or your parents or the law says that that's what we ought to do? I'd like to think about that one for a sec. It's really quite difficult to say, actually, but ultimately the challenge is to decide the right thing to do. And moral or ethical dilemmas occur when there's a conflict between two or more different courses of action which may have merit. Where there's literally no choice, there's no moral dilemma. It's the choice, I think, that causes the challenge. So how do they apply to us? Ethics, as they apply to us, we tend to distill them through several tiers. The basic tier is ethics in itself. That's the broad system of principles that govern our everyday decisions and how we conduct ourselves in our lives. The next tier, which apply to all of us here, is the medical ethics, which is much the same, but it applies to how we make the least bad decisions in the context of patient care. Now, I say that because budding bioethicists like myself are quite reluctant to use the phrase good, best, or right decisions, particularly as they relate to our third tier, which for those of us who are here in the military is an even higher tier of ethics which are imposed upon us, which is military medical ethics, as we're quite often faced with problems that go beyond the scope of normal peacetime medical ethics. As one prominent bioethicist says, this is because, and I'm going to read this quote, the exigencies of battle pose unique challenges incomparable to the civilian context because of the scale of the threats to life, unpredictability, and levels of violence. Now, we can have a quick snapshot of some ethical theories. We'll take a closer look at deontology, consequentialism, and principalist ethics next, because they're the most prevalent ones in teaching at the moment. So we have emotion versus reason. Emotion is a very strong driver in early life and tends to prompt those gut reactions, those gut decisions, principally due to underdevelopment and lack of life experience. I guess at that point, it's just a visceral reaction. And as we continue mature, deontology is a sort of more learned. It's things like follow the rules and do your duty. Consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is quite often touted as a classic example. For those of you who have ever seen the film Hot Fuzz, it's for the greater good. That's the principle there. It's the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Now, principalist ethics, that tends to form the core of medical and nursing ethics education, from what I can see, and that's sort of 4 core tenets, which we'll have a look at shortly. And if I can get my computer to behave, I'm terribly sorry. Virtue ethics, that talks about character. What will people think of me if I make this decision? What does it say about my character? And sort of the need for experience to shape you into the wise practitioner of the future. The important one to note, the quote in red at the bottom there, it was championed by Aristotle, amongst others, which says that only a lifetime of learning, making mistakes, and accruing experience can truly shape a wise person or a practitioner. Okay. Moving on to deontology. So deontology is the most widespread outlook to be found amongst the majority of Western peacetime medical practice. Now, this theory places duty at the heart of its ethical reasoning, because it literally translates from the Greek to mean the science of duty. Now, under its tenets, medical staff are duty-bound to preserve the life and well-being of their patients to the best of their abilities at all times, and must act to treat every person as an end and never as a means only. Now, on its own, it's a very strict theory, and it doesn't like deviation from its rules at all. The picture is of a guy called Immanuel Kant, who's one of the main exponents of deontology, and he developed a test, and he called it the categorical imperative. Not wishing to bamboozle you, it's another term for a moral rule, essentially, which in essence states that one must never act in such a way that would be bad for society in general, if that act were to be universally adopted as a societal norm. So take theft, for example. They don't like thieving, because if everybody was to thieve, we'd have social breakdown and anarchy. Same goes for killing. Don't kill. Don't tell lies, because everybody would be telling lies to each other, etc., etc. And it'd be bad for society if we were all to do it. Now, that's referred to as the universal formulation, which is the single imperative that drives all others. So you have to make sure what you're doing is good for society in general. Now, despite deontology being the prevalent model of medical ethics in the NHS, where the majority of you undertake your business, practitioners are not generally bound or recommended to be bound solely to one ethical theory. Now, that's in part because no codes of ethics have the force of law, and they're all open to an individual interpretation. So therefore, ethical guidelines issued to practitioners by the National Medical Associations for doctors, the BMA, are just that, guidelines. Now, the NMC Code of Conduct, as it applies to us, it's a bit more implicit than explicit with its ethical guidance than that of most of the medical associations. So theoretically, it leaves you open to develop your own dynamic and ethically comfortable stance on things that you work with as you see fit, as you continue to grow experience and seniority. However, the deontological theory is inherent in the NHS mandate for operational effectiveness. And it's also inherent in the Geneva Conventions, which the military medical services are bound to, in that there exists a clear duty of care for the sick and wounded, regardless of race, age, status, etc. So that sort of adds a legal dimension to the ethical framework for nurses, and continues to place duty at the heart of our principles. Okay, utilitarianism, bit of a contrast. It's a consequentialist theory, and it's called a consequentialist theory because they're concerned not with the act itself, but with the consequences, and not having good intentions necessarily. So as this theory focuses on the consequences of a given action, that decides its moral worth status as good or bad, right or wrong, whatever you want to call it. And that's why it's consequentialist. Now, the two guys here on the right-hand side of the screen, one of them is John Stuart Mill and the other is Jeremy Bentham. They were amongst the major exponents of utilitarianism. Now, they thought that they had developed a scientific basis for calculating what is right and therefore what our ethical obligations must be. Now, they said they did that by calculating the greatest total of utility of an action to a given society through maximizing pleasure or happiness and minimizing pain, and they called it the felicific calculus. Now, as I've put on the slide there, it is not a potion from Harry Potter that makes you lucky. I have had that comment in previous chats. So the problem is pain and pleasure are subjective criteria and open to wide interpretation. Likewise, so is happiness. If you ask 10 people what makes them happy, or 10 people, what would maximize the pleasure in this for you, you get 10 different answers. So it's difficult to quantify. So that's why it's sort of widely derided by other ethicists around the world. But as I said before, it's the hot fuzz factor, utilitarianism. If you remember nothing else, that's it. It's for the greater good. Now, principalist ethics is the one which is to be found most often in nursing and medical education. Deontology is criticized in ethics, as I said, for being too rigid an approach. And utilitarianism has so many types of utilitarianism, including hedonism. Actually, that's a branch of consequentialist ethics as well, which concerns doing only what pleases yourself and never mind anybody else. Beecham and Childress are the, I'm not quite sure why the picture's not come up. Well, there we are. Okay. Beecham and Childress. I'm having a great tech day today. I did run through this presentation several times. These are the guys who developed this theory, and it's been called perhaps the most influential framework in bioethics. Now, they identified the 4 key principles there, which you see in the middle: respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, so not doing harm, beneficence, actively doing good, and justice. Now, the first 3 of those, you'll note, are probably more closely linked with deontology. They respect individuals as independent moral agents with the right to choose how they live their own lives, avoiding harming others and actively doing good where they can. Now, the justice principle is mostly concerned with distributive justice, loyalty, and fairness. Rather than sort of fight about which was best, deontology or utilitarianism, the 4 principles came out of these 2 guys, Beecham and Childress, deciding that instead of arguing about the differences between the 2 approaches, they came together and to decide what they had in common, and that's where this came from. So they derived a number of rules as well, such as tell the truth, because you need to give honest and accurate information to your patients so they can make their own autonomous decisions about their care. Keep your promises, protect the privacy of others, and don't pass on to others information given to you in confidence, which rather presciently meets Caldecott principles and GDPR regulations as well, curiously. And this theory continues with the idea of keeping the individual central to the ethical discussion and the decision-making process, even if it is criticized from time to time for being rooted in abstract principles with sort of little relevance to real-life situations. Now, that's not ideal for an ethical framework which purports to assist in the decision-making process. Now, critics have derided it because it involves weighing principles against each other to balance the moral scales. And principles-based approaches like this have sometimes been criticized for presenting ethical judgment in terms of this mantra of principles, which students can rattle off and sort of convince themselves that they've got an understanding of ethics. So that's just sharing the good and bad points of those three main approaches there. So what are ethical decisions as opposed to other types? Ethical decision making refers to the process of evaluating and choosing amongst alternatives, but in a manner that's consistent with ethical principles, like I've just mentioned. And clinical decisions really are the substance of ethical decisions. And they're kind of interdependent, really, ethical decisions and clinical decisions. Becoming aware of our ethical values, the ethics of the healthcare setting, and the ethical value of patients is really necessary to make a sound clinical decision, which obviously is beneficial for the patients. If the problem's ethical, it should first be clearly defined in order to confirm or question the understanding of the problem. An ethical decision typically will take account of moral questions related to values or commitments or obligations or rights or duties and principles, things like that. There's a couple of authors called Forrester, Miller and Davis. They suggested that should the dilemma involve any of the principalist ethics issues or fidelity, then it's an ethical decision which is required. In making ethical decisions, it's quite useful to perceive and eliminate the unethical options and select the optimal ethical alternative. And the process of making ethical decisions requires using the 3 C's. First one being commitment, the desire to do the right thing regardless of the cost, followed by consciousness, which is the awareness to act consistently and apply your moral convictions to daily behavior, followed by competency, IT issues again, the ability to collect and evaluate information, develop alternatives, and foresee alternative consequences and risks. So the bottom line is true there. Good decisions are both ethical and effective. Ethical decisions tend to generate trust. They demonstrate respect, responsibility, fairness, and caring as well, actually. And they're consistent with good citizenship. Now, those behaviors give us a foundation for making better decisions by setting ground rules for our behavior. Effective decisions are effective only if they accomplish what we want accomplishing and if they advance our purposes. A choice that produces unintended or undesirable results is ineffective. So the key to making effective decisions is to think about choices in terms of their ability to accomplish our most important goals. Now I'll give you a moment just to reset your brain, because that was some pretty heavy duty stuff to rattle through there. The first, give you a couple of seconds to watch the cat, reset your brain.
Thanks, Alan.
You're welcome.
There's quite a few comments in the chat box if you wanted to pause for a moment. Or
oh, is there? Okay.
There's quite a lot from Roger, your supervisor.
I have no doubt.
Yeah, but Roger, no offense, we might focus on the others if that's okay. So we've got, I'm just going to scroll back to the top if you're happy to. Lots of comments that we can go through. So Sonia has got, as a learning disability nurse, we find our client group gets slapped with DNAR when in hospital. Is this ethical? Over to you. No.
Gets slapped with DNAR.
I presume that means
automatically being
consultation. Yeah.
Right. Well, that doesn't sound particularly good. But I mean, obviously, I don't know the background discussions that take place around there. There's got to be some sort of patient involvement, or when there's a lack of competence, there has to be some sort of next of kin or
there's nothing. I've recently had one with a UTI go in. They told us that they suspected dementia, and it was only that we were flicking through notes, well, the carers that were there with him, and they found the DNAR. Nobody had been informed. There's no family involvement. He's under court protection and stuff, but it just happens time and time again. I just wanted to sort of put it out there, and you know.
Right, okay, that doesn't sound particularly good, does it?
Well, it sounds like to escalate those issues.
Yeah,
actually.
I mean, I take it there is family to discuss it with.
No, there isn't.
There isn't any family, so he's a ward of the court, basically.
Yeah. And this happens, as I say, time and time again with patients that are sort of a similar background. It's just a shame, and I'll continue to fight for them, and we get them removed. But there's just, it's frustrating.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's the point then, where practitioners like yourselves, if you discover these things, that's the kind, if there's no family to stand up for him, and if he's a ward of the court, I don't imagine they'd go to court to apply for a permission to put a DNA on. They'll just do it on medical advice between themselves, won't they? So that's where practitioners like yourself really come into your own and sort of be advocates for your patients then, and do what you can on their behalf. Well, thanks for bringing that up.
Carry on.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Good to raise it. It's a topical issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's some more comments. Got lots of interest here. Just a comment from Sila saying, surely most decision making has an ethical and non-ethical element. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that one, Alan.
Well, as I said, I mean, if you're making an ethical decision, it's useful to sort of pick on the mostly unethical options and then sort of whittle it down a bit, and then choose the optimal solution from what's left. So yeah, every decision will have an element of unethical solutions.
Responses. Thank you. I think that's it for the moment. I'll hand back across.
Yep.
But lots of discussion. It's great.
All right, good. So this now is a little bit of a chance to sort of relax your brain a little bit, because the heavy theory stuff I've just gone through. This is more the practical side of the thought experiment, getting you to look inside yourself and think, well, what would I do in this situation? I don't know if you've ever heard of the trolley problem, but it was developed, as it says there, by, actually it was originally in the early 20th century in America. It was developed as a teaching tool, and Philippa Foot picked it up in 1967 and changed some elements of it around to make it this scenario here. And it was adapted again in 1986. Originally, this chap in the middle here next to the switch was inside and driving the trolley. Okay, so we'll talk about that now. And this has really got very popular since the old autonomous car ethical programming has gained prominence. And if you really want to explore your own ethical biases, I thoroughly recommend going to the website link at the bottom there, moralmachine.mit.edu, and that helps people to gather data on programming autonomous decisions for cars, but it also informs you of all your sort of unconscious biases, which is quite interesting. So originally this trolley problem was situated so that the trolley driver had to make the decision, as I said, but now, having been modified, it's the guy by the switch here is the moral agent in this scenario. So what you do, you see this runaway trolley car, which is racing towards people tied to the track. There's 5 people tied to the track in front, the straight track. And you're standing next to a lever that controls a switch in the tracks. And if you pull the lever, it'll redirect the trolley onto a side track there, and the 5 people on the main track will be saved. However, there is a single person tied to the side track. Now, on the face of it, and how it was originally designed is, you look at it sort of contrasting 2 approaches here, really. So the first action is you do nothing. You don't touch the switch, and you allow the trolley to carry on and kill the 5 people on the main track, and you save 1 life. Now, the deontological ethics behind that, a deontologist would say that in this situation, to act is morally impermissible, because moral wrongs are already in place in the situation. You've got people tied to the track. It wasn't you that did it. A trolley's racing towards them. That's not your fault. That switching the trolley onto another track basically constitutes you participating in the moral wrong, and it makes you partially responsible for the death, when otherwise no one would be responsible apart from the nasty person who tied them to the track, and you don't know who that is. So that would mean taking an active part in killing someone, and to a deontologist, killing is never acceptable, as I said, because it doesn't meet their categorical imperative. Hence why the action is morally impermissible. Even if the trolley were to carry on and plow through 100 people, it would make no difference to them. Now, the other option you've got is to pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track, where it will kill 1 person, but it will save 5. Now, I think you're guessing here, for the greater good, the utilitarian view asserts that it's not just preferable, but obligatory to steer to that track with 1 person on it. According to sort of the classical utilitarianism, not only permissible, but morally speaking, the preferred option, with the other option being no action at all and killing 5. Now, is that an action or is it an omission? Which is morally worse, do you think? Act and definitely cause the death of at least one person, or fail to act and let nature take its course, killing 5 people in the process? Now, what if I were to translate that to switching the ventilator off on an ITU patient at the end of life, or withdrawing artificial hydration and nutrition? Is that an act or is it an omission? Switching ventilators off, etc. What do we think?
Good question. Let's go to the chat box. Anyone want to answer that? Put your hand up, or if you wanted to put something in the chat box. We could pick on Roger, couldn't we? I think Roger,
no, fine.
Roger, this might be your time to shine.
Right, yeah, okay.
I think an act. So Roger's typed in, I think, an act.
Is that
no,
okay?
Diane's put an act, and Roger's added, UK law has had a hard time avoiding the accusation of fudging here.
Yes, I was just about to say that. Thank you, Roger. Is it an act or an omission? Well, the courts are leaning towards an omission of care, but it's assessed as in the best interests of the patient, and quite often they have to get court orders to do it. It's about intent, but it's still legally classified as a morally permissive form of passive euthanasia. It's a very complicated bit of legal smoke and mirrors, actually, called the acts omissions distinction. It's, in essence, it's a bit like, I don't know if there's any Star Trek fans out there, but it's a bit like the Kobayashi Maru. It's the classic unwinnable scenario, which illustrates in an ethical dilemma, as I said at the very start, someone will always inevitably lose out somewhere along the line. So, you know, it's to avoid medical staff and nursing staff being prosecuted, I guess, for an actual act of ending someone's life by pressing the switch off. So anyway, which to you is the more ethical of these options? Keep the track running, don't touch it, or turn it off onto the side track? Do a quick straw poll.
Come on, pop
Who would switch the tracks?
I think Jess is on the call. I might pick on Jess. Jess is from the foundation. What's your thoughts, Jess?
That is very mean, Lucy.
Sorry, I saw you pop up. My wonderful colleague.
Well, it's about picking the best out of a bad situation, isn't it? I guess. But oh my goodness, I'm not sure if I want to share which one I'd go for.
I can share my
on face value at the moment, with nothing else to read into it.
I would go for switching the track. So I would, yeah, I think I would.
You go for the greater good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd do the greater good. I'd run as fast as I could to try and get that one person as well. Couldn't run off the track. That would be right.
Okay, I think maybe Group Captain Lamb's got something to say on this subject as well.
I think I've had my sandwiches stolen, because again, it's when you and I first started to discuss this, it really truly does make you look at the scenario through a different lens, because there's a kind of dichotomy. It's knowing what you should do, but in reality, what you actually will do. And often these decisions have to be made at quite, I mean, if it's about a trolley coming down the tracks, you know, you're going to have to make these decisions quite quickly. So it would sometimes perhaps be a gut reaction, but I'm not sure for me, the gut reaction of actually pulling a lever, knowing that I'm harming somebody and going to kill somebody, I don't know in reality whether I could actually make that act.
And run away and go la 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 la.
In essence, murder somebody. You know, I'm not sure that I could do that. But equally, it's as you said right at the beginning, it's a really complex environment, because you don't know these people. But if you did, would you do it differently? And that's the next context of, I know what you're going to talk about, but it does. And I will absolutely shamelessly link you back to last week's presentation about the difficulties faced and having to deal with this as a carer. And we give you a toolkit to do that. So shameless plug twice.
I was saying, nice link back.
The one that ran on the 3rd. But yeah, I mean, our discussions and situations like we have today really makes you think about this, perhaps for the first time, and therefore have a bit of preparedness. But again, would it be any different if you knew some of these characters, or you had any sort of internal, maybe unacknowledged preference for one or the other? You know, and I don't want to steal your sandwiches now.
Well, that's all right. We could use a bit of trolleyology and we can add some variations to the scenario. How about that? You could sacrifice yourself. That's an option.
Well,
throwing yourself in front of the trolley in the hope that it will slow it down or stop it to save the victims.
Or you could attempt to try and not make that act of switching the tracks, but attempt to unhook at least one of them, however they're tied to the tracks, at least save one life, and therefore you would feel as though you'd achieved something, even though you're putting yourself in harm's way. But I think as carers, we do that anyway, probably without thinking.
Alan, we've got Martin said he's happy to share a military example if you're happy to go to the
go for
audience. Martin, over to you.
There will be some people on this who know me, but by way of introduction, I'm a retired military doctor with a certain amount of operation experience. Let me just give you a really practical example of this. So I was in charge of managing medical support on the NATO operation in Afghanistan. And we had the dilemma in which all of the most severely injured Afghan military patients were coming to NATO facilities. And so the Afghan hospitals were not learning how to care for severely injured casualties. But of course, they couldn't provide the same level of care as our military hospitals. So we took a decision that injured Afghan soldiers would be taken to Afghan facilities so that they would learn how to care for and properly treat severely injured casualties for the better benefit of their health system, recognizing that on an individual clinical basis, it probably meant they would not get the same care as if they'd gone to NATO facilities. So almost that's a trolley problem of military relevance.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two-tiered care later, but I usually talk about the military context, but obviously I've sort of added some NHS context to this one for this discussion. But yeah, exactly, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So a deontologist would say that self-sacrifice, well, it's actually difficult to assess because since the Kantian moral imperative demands universal rulings, usually including not killing anyone, which I would presume to include the self, the act remains problematic. However, from a consequentialist point of view, with all things considered and sort of taken at face value, they're a bit meh about self-sacrifice. They're not really bothered about what you do because ethically speaking, there's not much difference because both scenarios end with 1 dead and 6 alive. And it's either you that's dead or the one tied to the track that's dead if you self-sacrifice or don't. So either way, they're a bit ambivalent about the whole thing. Now, there's lots of scenarios you can add to this. I mean, lots. I've seen so many. What if the one person or the 5 people are colleagues of yours or close friends and the others aren't? What if the one tied to your tracks was your husband or wife? What if that one person on the tracks was a child? You know, that draws out emotive ethics, sort of the feminist ethics of care, and that talks about using interconnectedness and human caring nature to promote that strong nurture urge to protect children as a very strong moral imperative. What if that one person on the tracks was a child and the other 5 were OAPs? Distributive justice, they've had a good innings, they're at the end of their life while the child's at the beginning of theirs, you know, things like that. What if you knew for a fact that one of the people knew the cure for cancer, but you didn't know which one? I don't think a deontologist would alter their actions. That would still hold to the wrongness of killing, even if it refers to yourself. A consequentialist might feel a bit of a communitarian pull to sort of maximize the benefit to the humankind by taking whatever action they thought, and that might include throwing themselves in front of the trolley. You know, would it make a difference if anybody was watching you? That takes account of virtue ethics. What will people think if I make this decision? And would it make any difference if you could ask a watching crowd for advice? Reassign the blame. I was just doing what everyone told me. Principalist crowd autonomy, you know, versus the personal autonomy. Anyway, you could go on forever. There's another scenario here. There's a fat man on the bridge, and no, it's not me. Thank you. I have had that accusation flung at me many times. This is another adaptation of Foot's scenario by Judith Jarvis Thompson. As before, a trolley's hurtling down the track towards 5 people. You're on a bridge. underneath which the trolley will pass, and you can possibly stop it by throwing something heavy in front of it. Now, as it happens, there's a very fat man next to you on the bridge, and the only way to stop the trolley is to shove him over the bridge and onto the track, likely killing him and hoping he'll stop the trolley. Should you proceed? I can see people drawing teeth, like, not sure about that one. There's a little bit of a difference. It's an escalation, if you like. But what about if the fat man here was the bad guy that put these 5 people on the tracks in the first place? It changes the ethical outlook to it, certainly. But anyway, what we're talking about is what's morally justifiable versus the ethical imperatives to do things. And it's up to each person to decide what that constitutes. Now, this is the last one. This is the loop variant. Obviously, this is an amusing loop variant that I've put on the slide here, and it's not the actual loop variants, right? It's just a funny one. Remember me talking about hedonists doing exactly what they want to do and not caring about anyone else. So the loop variant is that the track continues in a loop to the other side, so that no matter what you do, after killing the first person or people, the trolley will continue around the tracks at speed and kill everyone else. So is it then ethically preferable to make one person watch 5 people die before they die, or to make 5 people watch one person die before they die? You confused? Well, you can bring it to life. On here, I think we're running out of time, actually, so I think I'm going to actually not play the scenario, but this link here on the screen, because I'm not allowed to embed a video in the presentation, is a link to a program called The Good Place. And that is a show all about ethics, but it's a comedy show, and it stars Ted Danson from Cheers and Kristen Bell. It's very funny, and if you want to know more about ethics, I highly, highly, highly recommend watching this show. It's hilarious, and there are 4 series of it. So if you go back to the presentation later and follow this link, type it in, and you'll see a scenario that really brings the trolley problem to life. And it's very funny, but unfortunately, I don't think I've got time to show it here today. And it also shows you a bit about this next adaptation as well. It brings this to life for you as well in a funny way. So you have a doctor who's got 5 patients who are each in need of a different organ, all of whom will die without that organ. Unfortunately, there's no organs available to do the transplants. However, a healthy young man, a traveller, comes wandering in for a checkup in the city the doctor works in. In the course of doing the checkup, the doctor discovers that this guy would be, you know what, a perfect match for all the organs my people need. And so suppose if the young man were to disappear, nobody would trace it back to the doctor because nobody knows where he is. So would you support the morality of the doctor in killing that tourist and harvesting his organs to save the 5 patients? Any particular thoughts on that?
Let's just go to the chat box, see what people's thoughts are.
That's another escalation, isn't it?
No.
No.
What's the difference here, though, between pulling the lever to redirect the trolley to kill 1 person to save 5? You're still acting to save 5.
But again, it's that dichotomy as to what you probably should do to save the majority, but knowing what you would therefore have to do would be wrong. So again, it just reestablishes the difficulty in this whole equation.
Yeah. It's about the wrongness of killing inherently,
Yeah.
isn't it? This is a big escalation to actively plan the murder of someone to save 5 people, whereas moral wrongs are already in place. In the other scenario, the moral wrongs are not in place yet in this scenario, and only would be if you decided to cut the young man up to get his organs. Right, anyway, let's just get you thinking about things like that, and you can talk about it. It's great to talk about in teams, this kind of thing. The trolley problem, you could go on all day about. It's fantastic, I love it. Just another quick reset slide there on the way through. So some ethical challenges that you might come up against in nursing. You may have come up against them already. I've got a little scenario here for you. Okay, we'll look at this scenario. You've got 2 identically injured patients. Okay, one's a policeman who's come in off duty, he's on duty, he's come in his uniform and everything, and one's a murderer who's been brought from a riot in prison. They've both got stab wounds in the chest, and they've got an identical prognosis, arrived at exactly the same time. Do you know what? Oh, there we are. We get 4 at once instead of 1 at a time. Brilliant. You've only got 1 chest drain left and 1 vial of local anaesthetic because it's Plymouth and you've been exceedingly busy. in town. The Marines have been out in town, so you've got no supplies left except that. So that's regarded as the gold treatment, the gold standard treatment. So one will get the gold standard treatment, and the other maybe gets a needle decompression and an uncomfortable ambulance ride to another facility. So who gets the best treatment and why? I think you know which way I want you to go. Just want to explain why.
Happy to either unmute yourself and give a response, or you can pop it in the chat box. I'm going to see if there's anyone else.
It's fine. I'll tell you what. It's fine. Don't worry. This scenario is typically used by Michael Gross, who's a friend of mine. He's a bioethicist in the States, but he does it with US military troops. And he gets the same answer every single time. So it's 2 soldiers in their case, 1 local soldier and 1 American soldier. And he gets the same answer. We treat the American soldier. In this case, we treat the policeman. Okay. Why? Because he's our brother. He's one of us, right? He's in the gang. He's a fellow public servant in this case, the policeman. He's got an honorable job, playing a major role in society. And this is known in bioethics circles as the ethics of camaraderie. And I mean, you could have any number of answers to this, and I have, split the tube in 2, which one arrived before the other, how old are they, is one of them ginger? I've had all sorts of queries about this, there's no ginger people. I'm not slagging off gingers, obviously I'm not. But then there's been a lot of debate about preferential treatment of comrades over anybody else. There's a lot to be said in the military and within sort of the public servant emergency services circle. Teams work together through horrendous conditions and hardships sometimes, and they support each other through some terrible things in very close proximity to each other. So, do you think it's right that fellow emergency workers should receive treatment priority over patients who are, shall we say, less useful to society?
There's interesting, quite a lot of comments coming through actually. So it depends on the clinical need, seems to be quite a theme.
Exactly. Well, this is the scenario where you have to suspend reality and just say there's nothing split between them. They've got identical prognosis. That's the question. It's based on face value. Right. So, what about if they're not even as badly wounded? If the policeman was only not as badly wounded as the murderer, what then? Do we treat by clinical need alone? Or is there something to be said? Some authors actually believe that in order to maintain operational effectiveness in the military, they have to depend on preferential treatment over impartiality, particularly when you're working in a scarce resources environment. And I've got no reason to suppose that doesn't translate into the NHS and emergency services as well. It's a question that you can ask yourself too, but I don't suppose you'll ever find out the answer unless you come up against it. Anyway, dual loyalty conflict. Dual loyalty conflict you may have come across. Essentially, it involves conflict between 2 external accountabilities, which are generally you can't resolve to the satisfaction of everybody. So simply put, it means at times your loyalties will be stretched or divided, and that creates ethical tensions. Everybody knows we've got obligations as nurses. Most of the time, we're free to operate under whichever personal code of ethics that we've decided to operate our lives by, which I've already discussed, in accordance with existing rules. So that's normal jogging, I would term that, just the normal routine. However, those occasions where obligations and personal codes of ethics are put into direct competition makes life a bit more difficult. It's much easier actually to illustrate this in military terms, because we answer to 2 masters. We've got the profession of arms, which is our senior officers and those set above us. We have to follow their orders and we take an oath to that effect. And we've also got our professional obligations that we answer to our nursing profession. So it's easier to demonstrate dual loyalty conflict. But in civilian terms, for example, there's a few examples. If you've got a newly diagnosed patient who's got maybe uncontrolled diabetes or epilepsy, and maybe he drives lorries for a living, and maybe he's lied to the doctor about his job so he can carry on driving, but he tells you in your clinic by mistake. He begs you to keep his secret. Now, morally speaking, the nurse has 2 competing loyalties, one to the patient, whose interests are best served by keeping his job, keeping the money coming in so he can look after his family and disabled child. And the other one is to society, by keeping a potentially dangerous driver off the roads until you get his condition under control. Legally speaking, the situation is probably much clearer, but morally speaking, that's the choice. What about a nurse who works for a sports team and she's come under pressure from the manager to put the star player on the pitch, even though he's not fully recovered from an injury, and he's still in pain from a previous injury. And that's a make or break game, and he's the star player. We can't do without him. On the one hand, she's got potentially a moral obligation to her employer, who keeps the money coming in and pays the bills and keeps the light on in her house. And the other one is to the player, to prevent deterioration in condition. And what about a little old lady that asks you to keep the extent of her condition from her husband, even though it's very clear that extensive support is going to be needed, nursing support in the house when she finally gets discharged? You want to do the best for your patient and sort of, do what they ask, but you've also got a responsibility to the husband to prepare him for what's coming. So it's a tricky situation, One scenario that I would use, for example, in a case-based learning scenario might be, what would you do if you were a nurse who was put under pressure by the authorities to declare someone fit for questioning, and there happened to be a seriously injured suspected terrorist, particularly if there's a time-sensitive plot behind it to blow up a dirty bomb in London on Christmas Eve? Now, what would you do? Would you bow to pressure, or would you, I'm terribly sorry, you must go get a court order? Yeah, so that's the question, really. I just wanted to introduce you to dual loyalty conflict. The International Council of Nurses, they've got quite an idealistic position statement on nurses and human rights. And they say, where a nurse faces a dual loyalty, that is the conflict between their professional duties and obligations to their employer or some other authority, the primary responsibility is to those who require care. And that would include taking action like whistleblowing to safeguard human rights. Now, that obviously doesn't apply explicitly for exceptions such as serious public health concerns, which might require mandatory reporting, or detention despite a patient's wishes, etc., or crimes that you have to report. So I just wanted to introduce you to that, and that essentially is a great topic for discussion in case-based learning. Right, there we are. In the 18th century, General Baron Dominique Jean Larrey, who was Napoleon's Surgeon General, developed the concept of triage, which involved sorting casualties on the periphery of the action in mobile treatment areas, in the order of complexity of treatment, to determine those that were most able to be returned to the battle as quick as possible to keep numbers up. Now, that's a utilitarian practice known as salvage medicine, which basically lies at the ethical difference between normal civilian and military triage methodologies. Now, in practice, civilian and military triage management differs very little, certainly routinely at home and in deployed environments, even up to the point of disaster and mass casualty situations. The approach only differs drastically in the military context when the military commanders give us military goals or objectives, which primarily I would take to mean winning battles, because generally speaking, if you win enough battles, you win the war. They might be in dire jeopardy through the fact that you've lost lots of soldiers, or you've got a dire shortage of medical resources. Now, conventional NHS triage, 2 to 5 minute consultation, sorts patients into treatment pathways based on the principle of greatest clinical need. We can all agree. I would class that as a sort of an egalitarian approach to care and resource allocation. The little old lady with the impacted bowel gets seen before the rugby player's twisted his ankle and treated quicker, which is quite right. Now, the nurse is the coordinating point between deciding the patient need and allocating the resources needed. Now, most of the time, a treatment facility's resources will be sufficient to meet routine clinical responsibilities. However, the military and our deployed facilities, we've got to rely on everything we've got in place. That's the staff, that's the number of treatment areas and the consumables that we have, as well as the sort of the status of the staff, that is, how tired they are mentally and physically, depending on how long, because there's no one to replace them. We can't call agency in, etc. And we've been known to run dry in the past. Now, during World War I, there's about 19 million in total were wounded. And it wasn't unusual for a single casualty clearing station to take over 2,000 patients in a single day. Now, in this kind of situation, there's a utilitarian calculation of the maximum good for the maximum number of people takes over as the guiding principle. If we were to maintain an entirely treat by medical need alone ethos, in the face of overwhelming casualties like that, we'd quickly become ineffective. So it's a constant source of ethical tension deciding on the allocation of scarce medical resources. Typically stuff like cold products like blood, because they're very difficult to resupply. Even the Red Cross, who wrote the Geneva Conventions, deviate from their own policies, that they restrict emergency surgical intervention to those assessed as requiring less than 4 units of blood to achieve hemostasis. They've been known to do that on deployments. There's academic papers out there about it. However, COVID has sort of brought that to life really recently in the NHS. It's made it a reality. We've all seen those patients with the best prognosis, often younger, being prioritised for ITU beds or ventilators or life-saving drugs or research trials. And we've witnessed those inter-regional squabbles over bed allocations as units fill up to capacity. We've seen an unprecedented amount of staff absence, which has compounded the whole personnel as a scarce resource element. And I know that in Plymouth because I had to do the workforce management to throw all of our military resources in to help the NHS while we're there. You know, we built the Nightingale hospitals in cooperation with the civilians, and huge bed numbers, but with greatly reduced staffing plans. So we had non-specialist nurses looking after ITU patients on ventilators, medics, etc., who were being distally supervised by maybe one nurse, one ITU nurse per 6 beds, and one doctor per ward or unit. Goodness knows how they thought the NHS were going to be able to staff it from within the existing workforce, given those those conditions at the time. Now that's basically meant that scarce resource allocation is now on everybody's mind. And I think that nurse leaders need to sort of include that concept in ethical discussions with their teams, just to continue the awareness really. Now, two-tiered care, I think this is the last couple of little bits really. Two-tiered care means a select minority of patients in a population at risk have got access to a different tier of healthcare than the majority, as Professor Bricknell was talking about earlier on. Now, in the military, in general, that means that the host nations we deploy to don't have comparable healthcare standards to us. They don't have the infrastructure or the supply routes or services compared to the NHS. So that means we become the gold standard of treatment in that area that we're in, which obviously is an attractive proposition to the local civilian population, because it represents quite a step up in available healthcare standards. However, the only people that are typically entitled to use our services, and it comes from a politically set rules of eligibility, are UK coalition troops and selected international partners and contractors, which leaves the majority without. But in essence, we're not there to be the NHS Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever we are. That's a political decision to deploy us. Now, in the UK, two-tiered care I take generally to mean to that increasing trend of people using private hospitals to access routine investigations and surgery, etc., performed by their chosen consultants, or straight to the most experienced doctor in the tree, more quickly, so they'd effect skipping NHS waiting times. Now, regardless of the situation, that first example holds true. It's access to a different tier of healthcare that is available to the majority. So what are your thoughts on private healthcare and access to that versus the sort of the NHS access and what have you? Do we think we should all have the same access to the same healthcare provision? Or do you think it's necessary to have an extra tier? We've all seen the odd private patient coming through, perhaps after operations, etc., in a private hospital to be fixed by the NHS, if you like. Any particular thoughts on that? Any strong feelings?
Go to the chat box. You could argue the Australian system's got quite a good, fair, equitable, is that everybody pays their tax, don't they? Towards so you pay high taxes if you can afford it, and that's based on access to private healthcare. Yeah. And I guess if you can afford private healthcare, it would take the pressures off the NHS for those that can't afford private healthcare.
I certainly wouldn't like to live in an American system, because I remember the Obamacare debates. We had Republicans. So you've got the Democrats are saying, you've got this guy's lying here bleeding in the hospital entrance. What are you going to do? And the Republicans let him die. What?
Terrible. You do hear stories, don't you? I cannot, asking for a credit card, don't you?
Yeah, God,
it's terrible.
Cannot fathom that. Anyway.
Got some comments coming in, so I'll just quickly read them to you, and please feel free if you want to comment as well verbally. Private healthcare essentials. NHS cannot provide timely. Private healthcare is essential.
Okay.
NHS cannot provide timely care.
Okay.
It's a difference between equity and choice from Martin. Police officer waiting 6 months for surgery, or pay for surgery and get them back to work after 2 months. There's that argument.
Yeah, I mean, the NHS pays to have private hospitals do some of their backlog lists, etc.
They do,
well.
they do lots of contracts they get, yeah. Or independent healthcare, sometimes it's referred to.
Okay, interesting. Both sides of the spectrum. Okay, conscious that we'll run out of time, or have run out of time. I take you sort of pretty much onto the what is the last slide, really. So it's, I don't wish to teach anyone to suck eggs, as I said, but I just want to give you some top tips that come out of the literature and sort of from experience, etc. So for nearly 20 years, nursing's topped Gallup polls as the most honest and ethical profession. Ethics, I think we can all agree, are an essential component of leadership, and the ethical nurse leader can help create an ethically supportive atmosphere for their team, offer ethical guidance, and ensure occupational satisfaction of their teams, because you're sort of helping to prioritize moralities, etc., on your area of work. So for nurse leadership and ethical decision making to work together, nurse leaders should be prepared to review the kind of ethical challenges they commonly encounter or their staff perceive, and attempt to try and determine the best way forward to resolve the difficulties. Now, there's some researchers in the Journal of Medical Ethics and the History of Medicine said that nurses who practice ethical leadership in their daily actions advance positive behaviors in healthcare. True. And some other researchers examining obstacles and problems of ethical leadership from the perspective of nurse leaders said that ethical leaders must strive to model and support ethical performance, and at the same time be sensitive to moral issues and enhance their nurses' performance by fostering respect for human dignity, therefore promoting patient safety, increasing the capacity to discuss things, and basically acting upon ethics in every daily activity and supporting your ethical competence of your team. Now, as a nurse, you've also got the chance to influence other professions as well, because you work with them on a daily basis, HCAs, nursing associates, allied health professionals, etc. And a nurse can also actually be a major influence in the patient's perception of your organization as a whole, in the microcosm of your own department. They take that and apply it to the whole organization. So, nurses really have got to be ethical in their leadership of patients and their families through their journey, is at the bottom line. Now, before nurse leaders can adapt and implement the ethical standards, they kind of need to really understand the components of ethical decision making as they apply to nurses. And I think we've covered all of them actually as we've gone through. A number of worldwide nursing leadership organizations have agreed these universal ethical principles as a kind of a baseline for ethical nursing practice, and you won't be surprised to see them again. There's benevolence, obviously. Nurses have to be committed to helping patients and seeking out the best possible healthcare for them at all times. No, I'm not going to get 3 at once here now, am I? Of course I am. Right, there we are. Non-maleficence. Nurses must make sure they're not purposely harming patients in their care, which we tend not to do. That goes all the way back to Nightingale's initial mandate: we must do no harm. While treatments and procedures themselves can have negative impact on patients, the nurses should certainly not be causing intentional harm. And unfortunately, looking at the NMC register, that's not been hoisted in by all nurses, unfortunately. Fidelity. Nurses should be faithful to their promises and responsibility to provide high quality care and safe care. Accountability. Obviously, nurses have to accept the personal and professional consequences of their actions. Veracity. We talked about truthfulness. That's a cornerstone in nursing and something patients depend on. So patients should be able to depend on their nurses for the truth, even if the truth hurts, in inverted commas, not literally, obviously. Patient autonomy. Patients are obviously entitled to know all about their treatment options, and they've got the right to make decisions on their healthcare. They also equally have a right to refuse treatment and medication if necessary. If a patient doesn't have the capacity to understand, this goes back to what we talked about earlier on, next of kin or sort of healthcare power of attorney should be consulted, or at least carers if they live in a care situation, as we talked about earlier on. And justice. Some have added a 7th dimension, which is justice, which obviously it speaks of giving just desserts, giving everybody a fair crack of the whip. So in addition to understanding the components of ethical decision making, nurse leaders have got to be able to help their nurses handle the fallout that comes out of poor ethical choices. So failure to address the moral distress that comes out of poor ethical decision making can absolutely wreak havoc on a nursing team, because moral distress, as it increases on a unit, staff turnover has been noted to increase and also leads to a loss of job satisfaction, which is why I talked about making your nurses sort of satisfied in their jobs with ethical leadership. And that's something I'm looking at as well as moral distress in the nursing ethical decision-making process in my PhD. So to provide your nurses with the tools they need to identify personal ethical frameworks, nurse leaders should basically think about taking these steps. Identify and discuss the nursing unit's common ethical dilemmas, as I mentioned. Organize some form of ethics committee or an ethics-based journal club, which actually has pretty good results. I've done that before. And maybe identify ethical champions in everyday life. So get some people to work on your behalf. Develop ethics-friendly policies and procedures if you haven't already, backed by theory and expert guidance if possible. Provide continuing education and training in ethical decision-making. I really, really heartily recommend case-based learning and using models like we'll be looking at in the next session. I don't think there's any substitute for it in this type of discussion. And also promote open discussions amongst the nursing workforce and managers as it relates to ethical patient care. And possibly most importantly, in addition to following the guidelines and decision-making theories, nurse leaders should trust in their instincts and use their well-honed instincts and experience to their full advantage when you're looking at ethical dilemmas. If something doesn't feel right to you, it probably isn't and will require drilling down into, right? Trust that sixth sense, if you like. Nurses are typically ruled by their hearts, so my study participants say, and coming from them, there's a lot to be said about nurse leaders' experience in this and the sleep at night or being able to look at yourself in the mirror factor at the end of the day. So if you go home carrying something like that, can you look at yourself in the mirror? If not, probably should have sort of dealt with it and drilled down deeper into it before you left, because it'll just play on your mind. And there endeth my session. A little bit late, terribly sorry about that. There's a bit more discussion.
That was incredible. But there's we've probably got time for about 5 or 10 minutes of questions. I know we've run over, but I'm sure there's lots of people who want to ask you things, Alan. It's such a wealth of knowledge. I've learned so much this afternoon. Got your contact details as well if people wanted to contact you, so thank you so much for that as well. So we'll go across to the group. Wow, lots of people still here. So would anyone like to ask any questions, or would you like to sit in there? Have lots of thank yous. Thought-provoking lecture, Alan, which I concur. You put on Merry Christmas as well. It's very nice.
Merry Christmas to everybody. Yeah.
Lots of food for thought. Excellent presentation. Anyone like to ask it? I think David just unmuted. Did you want to ask any questions, David?
I just wanted to say to Alan, because we work together.
I saw you unmute.
I won't hold your being a theatre nurse against you.
I've passed you a few sets of forceps in my time, so yeah, thank you.
And we've gone through ethical decision making together.
We have.
So it's great to see you give such a good lecture. You've really motivated people.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Any other comments? Anyone else like to ask? Oh, Roger.
Ellen,
I thought Roger might have a question.
Just one comment. It's been really interesting. What I think you do need to think about is the implications of admitting or saying that there's no right or wrong answers.
Okay.
In relation to ethics, anyway. Because otherwise, surely we end up with what we call moral nihilism. There is no ethics. But obviously, there is, because it's, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, looking at the literature, looking at the military medical ethics literature, I'm just kind of the consensus of opinion that I was just talking about there is that, in fact, it's been discussed at conferences as well, that they're cautious to use the terms right and wrong when there are so many shades of grey. There's never a black and a white as such in ethics, but yeah, I'm quite happy to chat about blacks and whites in terms of, you know, absolutes.
I think Martin's next. Martin wanted to ask a question. Thank you, Martin.
I've got a couple of points for me. The first one is that, particularly in terms of law of armed conflict, many of the things that are legally prescribed are derived from ethical principles. So I would slightly challenge your point that everything's up for debate. I think there are some things that are absolutely not, because they're enshrined in international humanitarian law. And indeed, I would argue one of the features of a, should perhaps call it a democratically accountable military, is that transgressions are also held to account.
Yeah.
But my question to you would be, to what extent do you think that ethics in healthcare is independent of profession, or does each profession need to have their own ethical framework?
Well, I think pretty much all the professional organizations have developed their own codes of ethics for their practitioners. And like I said, some are more explicit than others. The BMA and the GMC have got their own idea about ethical conduct for their doctors. Not sure about the HCPC actually, but obviously there's international codes of ethics for nurses, as well as the RCN's frameworks for how we conduct ourselves in daily practice. But as I said, the nursing ones, particularly the British ones, tend to be more implicit than explicit. I think the only explicit ethical thing in the NMC's code of conduct is, if you're advertising professional services, make sure you don't lie about it or make false claims. And the rest is just to be taken as be a good ethical practitioner, whatever that means. It doesn't describe it. It may be that the type of work you do requires different ethical codes. I don't know. I mean, some people are, the doctors tend to make the more life or death decisions. They're the ones who are actually conducting the operations and sort of diagnosing a lot of the patients, et cetera, et cetera. So it may be that necessarily your codes of ethics would be slightly different from other professions. But I don't think these, well, obviously the principles remain universal, but it's which parts of the ethical theories and principles you choose to run your personal code of ethics by. You've got your guiding frameworks, which have no force in law in themselves. They're kind of open to interpretation. But like you say, the law is the ultimate moral arbiter. The judge makes the final decision in those situations. He has to be black and white, because you have to decide guilty or not guilty. But there are rather a lot of grey areas, and that's what the judge has to reconcile when he's making those. The law and ethics are very, very closely tied with each other. And they've got something of a special relationship with the medical professions, and they always have, looking back through history. So yeah, I think, I don't think there's a need for a single version of truth for ethical codes of practice. I think each profession will continue to make their own ethical practice guidelines and frameworks for their practitioners. However, as I said, it's up to each practitioner to take what they will from the various different areas and decide for themselves what the most ethical practice is, as long as you can justify it in a court of law. I mean, I usually say to my students, right, if you're thinking about an ethical decision and explaining it to someone why you've made that decision, just add the words "malud" at the end and see if it carries over as well.
Thanks, Alan. Any other questions? There's lots of comments and thanks for a fascinating presentation. Even from Belgium, we've had an international audience.
Oh, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
And I think Roger's got his hand up. Probably time for 2 more questions.
A very quick point about the law, Alan. You
Yes.
need to think about, I'm sure you do, natural law and positive law. That big debate within the legal system. And if ethics ends up like positive law, just what a country makes and so this is the law. And again, ethics will disappear off the radar. But of course, natural law also has its own problems too. So
thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Gotcha.
Any other questions before we finish up this afternoon? I'm so glad you're coming back for a second workshop, Alan, because I've got
that's the exciting bit. That's the exciting bit next time we get into the case-based learning and how to talk through ethical dilemmas. It's great.
I can't wait. I really can't wait. And you said at the beginning, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to show you, said it's quite a dry topic. You've definitely brought it to life. It's been a fascinating afternoon. Any other questions before we finish up this afternoon? I know we've overrun, so apologies for that, but Alan was such a captivating captivating presenter, so it's great to have you.
Well done, Alan. You didn't actually need me as your Debbie McGee, did you?
I didn't have to go, die, help.
Held court. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining. This has been recorded this afternoon, as I said earlier, so you can share it with colleagues and come back and revise or review again. And obviously watch that clip from the Good Place. I'm certainly going to be watching that as well.
Amazing
Looking forward
series.
to that.
Yeah.
Great stuff. But
Right,
thank
thanks
you for
very much, guys.
educating us all, and it's been an absolutely enthralling afternoon, and I
Lovely.
can't wait for the next one.
Brilliant.
Thanks all. Take care of
Thanks all for
yourselves.
coming,
Thanks
and
for
have a
joining us.
Merry Christmas, everybody. Thank you.